Tom, you were mentioning about imagining what could have gone on in the cockpits, and really there are two basic scenarios in a hijacking. Either you have the hijacker standing there with a gun at the pilot's head or an explosive device of some kind ordering the pilot to make the maneuvers on the plane, or you have the hijacker actually taking over from the pilot and operating the controls of the plane himself. Now this is all speculative, but just an opinion here. I think to hit a precise target like the World Trade Center there and hit it right on the mark, that in this case you'd have to have the hijacker at the actual controls of the plane, because it's hard for me to imagine how you would force a pilot, even gun at his head or anything else, at the last moment. A single jerk of the plane's equipment could manage to miss the tower of the World Trade Center, perhaps go into the river, or imagine the Pentagon. You could go into a parking lot or an area right around there if you could jerk the yoke of the plane at the last moment. So I'm guessing that it's much more likely that the hijackers somehow disabled the crew and took over the control of these planes. But we may know eventually, because presumably the cockpit voice recorder has survived on each of these four airplanes, and the cockpit voice recorder would give you the actual conversation in the cockpit. Sometimes you can't precisely reconstruct what went on from what's being said back and forth, but the cockpit voice recorders of those four planes should give you at least everything that was said in the cockpits.
You're watching live NBC coverage of the terrorist attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C. This is KCRA-TV, Sacramento.
We said all the domestic planes had landed, and we now hear that there are 10 to 12 international flights, all of them bound into the West Coast, so presumably they were on the long Pacific run, or else the even longer Europe to the West Coast run. The 10 to 12 international flights still in the air. That's the last of it. All the domestic flights, as we'd said before, have landed.
All right, thanks, NBC's Robert Hager. We're going to go right now to, here's an update. The NBC affiliate in Omaha, Nebraska says that Air Force One has landed at Offutt Air Force Base, which is the headquarters of the Strategic Air Command. It's just south and east of Omaha. That is a place that the president very likely would go. It could not be more secure. They have a long landing pattern there and clear area all around them. And of course, they've got one of the most secure bunkers anywhere in the world. It was the critical part of our Cold War strategy. The Strategic Air Command bunker, as I recall, having been down there, it's about 6 stories beneath the ground, and it is heavily reinforced, and it has all the communications that you can possibly imagine. That, it does appear, is where the president is going to be for the time being, at least, until they sort out whether this wave of attacks is over. The Strategic Air Command is been removed from our consciousness a lot because of the end of the Cold War, but now we know what the consequences are of having one war over and another begin. This is an act of terrorism that has occurred here today. We're going to go to Pat Dawson now as we look at these scenes of what it's like in lower Manhattan. The phrase nuclear winter has been used again and again, and it's not inappropriate. Pat?
No, it's not, Tom. Certainly, I can tell you that when we were standing just about 2 or 3 blocks south of here at that bridge that you can see down there, probably at that point about 6, 7, 8 blocks north of the World Trade Center this morning when that tower went down and the smoke literally billowed and the dust up the avenue. It was precisely like the movies that we have seen. Much of this is like movies. It is very, very hard as a reporter. You know that the first thing you do is reach for something to make a comparison to, and frankly, through much of this, it's almost impossible for me to find things that are a satisfactory comparison. Let us try to find out now as much as we can. This is Inspector Gene Ciccarelli from the Port Authority Police. Inspector, if you can give us some sense at this point of how close you are able to get your rescue units in there.
We've been attempting to get our rescue units into the area. Unfortunately, there are areas that are under possibilities of collapsing. We're still searching a good portion of the perimeter, and as far as going in any further than that, we have to get a clearance to make sure that there is no potential danger for any further collapse that can endanger the rescue operation.
Now, just to explain to the people who may not know this, and certainly people outside New York who don't, there are 2 towers, or were, to be more accurate, 2 towers of the World Trade Center complex, yet there are still other fairly large office buildings as part of the complex, correct?
There are other what they call plaza buildings surrounding the two Twin Towers.
Right, and those are how big?
Some of them range from 20 stories, approximately 20 stories.
By the standards of much of America, that would be a skyscraper, quite frankly.
Well, I wouldn't put them on the
But
level.
still, they're rather large buildings. They're still standing there. Is that part of the threat that you perceive at this point?
Yes, there are those other plaza buildings that we are concerned about and do have the potential of collapsing. So, in answer to your question, it isn't wise to enter into that area at this point.
How would you describe your efforts to organize the rescue effort now, given that we saw a sequence of events this morning, a sequence of crashes, then explosions, and then the collapses? How close are you now, perhaps, to being able to organize an actual rescue effort to go in there and start going through the debris?
We still have, like I said, a concern about going in and initiating a rescue if, in fact, there are other individuals there. We also have a very good operation in place at this time to pool all of our resources together in one staging area. That we have a phenomenal amount of equipment and supplies that would assure us of any efforts that we make to continue with the rescue approach. But at this point, we do have a good group assembled for that purpose.
But at this point, presumably there may be a great number of people in there in need of rescue. Obviously, the problem for you is that if you go in to try to get them out, you put your rescuers in danger.
That's correct.
And no idea of when you might be in a position to actually say, we think it's safe to go in after them now.
No, until we get a firm clearance on that, we won't enter into an area that could be hazardous to people that are attempting to make the rescue.
Inspector, thank you very much for speaking to us. We appreciate it. Tom, the latest from the Port Authority Police here in New York City. As we've explained, they have jurisdiction over the World Trade Center complex. They, of course, are working in cooperation with a number of other police and rescue and fire agencies here, both local and federal, and essentially describing the quandary that they find themselves in, which is rather rare, certainly unique in the sense that we have seen the catastrophe repeatedly. We have seen through the morning 3 or 4 events which would qualify by anyone's description as catastrophes. It has now been probably a good 4 hours since the last one, but yet they still can't go in and begin a serious, comprehensive rescue effort because they're worried about what might still be there, what danger might still lurk for the rescuers that have gone in. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC's Pat Dawson. This terrorist war that has been declared on America today in New York City and Washington, D.C., and psychologically across the country has had such an enormous effect already. It has all but immobilized the largest nation in the world politically. There's been a severe realignment of where people can go and do their jobs in the nation's capital. Dennis Hastert, the House Speaker, was whisked out of his office. The President of the United States, we believe right now, is at the Strategic Air Command headquarters outside of Omaha. We don't know where Vice President Cheney is, except we're told that he's in a secure location. Don Rumsfeld is back at his desk in a more secure location. Secretary of State Colin Powell is on his way back from Peru. Then you have the economic consequences. The largest financial market in the world was shut down today. People were in peril in that immediate vicinity. Businesses across America are doing no business, my guess is. Certainly in the largest cities, so many of them have been shut down. All flights have been grounded at this point. And all baseball games have been suspended. The Seattle Space Needle was shut down. Walt Disney World was evacuated. In California, Knott's Berry Farm was evacuated, and a lot of other theme parks. All national monuments have been evacuated today as well. This country is on hold in shock and horror, and probably the beginning of a great deal of anger and frustration as well. We're told that all planes now that were in the air have landed safely. The domestic flights, there are still some international flights that are yet to come here. We'll have to deal with our shock and grief in the days to come, and there will be a realignment of this country in so many ways, the forms of which we cannot say now, because we're going to have to work this out together, individually, and certainly from our political and our economic institutions. But certainly there will be a change in security and a loss of innocence, especially for young people who have never been through anything quite like this. The most devastating attack since Pearl Harbor, some people saying worse than Pearl Harbor. at this time.
desk.
Let's go to Virginia Chow of NBC News, who was down in the area. Virginia, what was it like?
Well, Tom, you've already heard the unbelievable stories of people who survived, who are much closer to ground zero at the World Trade Center area. I was about 20 blocks north of that, and I witnessed the second tower collapsing. And what I observed and what was amazing to me were the reactions of the people as they watched this unfold around them. You have to remember that these are people who were streaming away from that area, who just minutes before were near the building or perhaps even in the building. And as I headed on foot going toward the World Trade Center, this was this morning when there was one tower still remaining. The first one had already collapsed. I was about 20 blocks north of there. There were thousands of people literally streaming toward me on foot, trying to escape that area like refugees from a war zone. I was one of the lone people, other than emergency personnel, heading toward the area when we heard a rumble. People stopped, turned to look, and we watched in horror as the second tower came crashing down on itself. People screaming out, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh no." And immediately, very emotional, people crying in tears, realizing that there were hundreds, maybe thousands of people in and around that building who were going to be either badly hurt or killed. And I think that the emotional impact of this for people, even if they don't know anyone personally down there, has been devastating. Tom?
Thank you very much, Virginia Chow, who is one of the many NBC reporters who have gone beyond the call of duty today in the lower part of Manhattan. There is the scene. It was not a cruise missile. It was not a nuclear attack. It was a hijacked airliner used as a weapon directed at the World Trade Center. The Twin Towers both came down. We know that more than 100 people on the airliners were killed, and an untold number of people were killed or seriously wounded in and around that area. And as you look at these scenes from several hours after the planes hit the building and after the World Trade Center came down, you have some sense of the magnitude of the devastation. Jules Rennell is the manager of the World Trade Club at the World Trade Center. He, fortunately for him, was not there today. Mr. Rennell, how many people would be in the building, in your judgment, at 8:45 in the morning?
Probably somewhere around 20,000 people, Tom. A lot of the financial institutions like Cantor Fitzgerald and Morgan Stanley Dean Witter open early. So all those people would be in the building early, with the rest of the population coming in between 8:30 and 9:30.
Where were you when you heard about all this?
My son called me, and I came down and I turned on the television and saw the flames coming out of the building. And at that stage, recognized, the magnitude of what was happening. But in my wildest imagination, could never believe that those buildings could be destroyed. I mean, the Trade Center itself is like a small city. 35,000 people work there every day. Countless thousands of people visit the World Trade Center. The restaurant on top where I work, Windows on the World, is probably one of the most recognizable restaurants in the world. I just couldn't believe I was sitting here watching the buildings collapse. It was a nightmare.
How many people work in the World Trade Club itself?
We had about 40 people in Windows on the World in the club this morning. There were some kitchen crew in there. There were the accounting people, the banquet staff, some cleaning people, and they were prepping to open up for lunch at 12 o'clock in the Greatest Bar. We've been able to find some of the people through our network of telephones, but there are still a number of people that we haven't been able to find yet. Even though, the communication systems after the first bombing had improved dramatically with emergency lighting and back lights, etc., we just don't know if those people were able to get through the fire, which was below them as opposed to above them. So there are many, many people, many of our friends and colleagues that are not accounted for right now.
Mr. Rennell, I know this is a very difficult day for you, so I'll let you get about the business of trying to contact those people who work for you, and we thank you very much for being with us. Let's go to NBC's David Gregory. David, where's the president?
The president, Tom, has just arrived in Omaha, Nebraska at Offutt Air Force Base. there. He will convene a National Security Council meeting with the national security team back in Washington via video conference, we are told. The president, you'll recall, left where I am, which is Sarasota, Florida, earlier today after making a statement about this attack at an education event, which was, of course, scrubbed. His intention at that point was to return to Washington promptly. Security concerns forced him to go to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where he made another statement, and now to Nebraska. The White House is telling us he still intends and desires to go back to Washington as soon as he can, but again, security precautions are forcing the president to go to these various locations. Offutt Air Force Base, a secure location for him where he can go about the business of meeting with the national security team. Vice President Cheney, as you have mentioned, running an operations center at or near the White House. We are not told for sure where he is, other than he's in a secure location. The president on Air Force One has contacted a number of the principals who are working in the rescue efforts, namely Mayor Giuliani, Governor Pataki of New York, and of course he has spoken to his wife, who is testifying on Capitol Hill, the First Lady Laura Bush, and the family's also been in touch with their daughters, who are also in a secure location now. Tom.
All right, thanks very much, NBC's David Gregory. We're also told that at Offutt Air Force Base, which is the home of the Strategic Air Command, there is the Doomsday plane. It was built to be flying White House for the president in case of nuclear attack. We think that that's where it is located. For a long time, you remember, you heard about the famous Looking Glass missions, B-52s in the air at all hours so that they could launch an attack if this country were ever attacked. The Dr. Strangelove movie scenario came out of all of that. No one ever anticipated that we would have a day quite like today in which the President of the United States would be forced to go to Offutt, the Strategic Air Command headquarters in the middle of America, because of an attack on the Pentagon and on New York City, and another plane that was hijacked and went into the ground outside of Pittsburgh. This was an all-out military assault under terrorist terms on the United States, innocent civilians used as weapons against other civilians, and also the United States Pentagon, which of course is emblematic of the United States military. So the United States government does have a series of contingency plans. Those are being put into effect. The president will have a national security meeting. I would guess the first order of business would be, what is the level of continuing threat against this country? What do we know about what may happen next, and who were these people, and how do we respond? Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager. Robert?
Tom, breathtaking, by the way, what that man from the World Trade Center said about 20,000 people supposed to be in there at that hour of the morning. So goodness knows where this toll is going. What we do know in terms of hard numbers are those killed on the various flights, so these airplanes that were turned into weapons. And that total is 266 in the 4 planes that were hijacked. 2 of the 4 were leaving Boston, and the other 2 leaving Newark and Washington's Dulles Airport. There you see the numbers adding up to 266. Planes turned into weapons, 2 of them into the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, and the other crashes before it reaches its intended target, crashes somewhere in the rural Pennsylvania. U.S. air traffic at a standstill now. All airports in the U.S. closed to commercial traffic. No takeoffs, no landings permitted, with the exception that there are still 10 or 12 international flights that have yet to land on the West Coast. That situation at the U.S. airports will continue at least until noon tomorrow, and then a reassessment will be made at that point whether to begin reopening U.S. airlanes, but no word yet on whether that may happen or not. Simply that it's a ground until noon tomorrow to all commercial flights, domestic and international. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Robert Hager. Speaking of flights and people who are expected, Colin Powell is expected to land in Miami, Florida shortly. He was en route to Peru when he was turned around. The Secretary of State, it's not known if he will remain there or continue elsewhere. The president, as we have just been reporting, is in Omaha. The Vice President Dick Cheney in a secure but undisclosed location. Don Rumsfeld also working in a secure location. He was in the Pentagon when it was hit by that plane and rushed to the scene to assist with some of the rescue efforts that were being made. And then as this story began to unfold and people began to have an appreciation of the gravity and the magnitude of it beyond the first attack, then some extraordinary steps were being taken to make sure that the highest officials in the land were in secure places. No doubt that that was going on in financial institutions as well, especially given the location of the World Trade Center. And that has been going on around the world in most of the democracies. Certainly it's been true in Western Europe. Martin Fletcher is in Tel Aviv. On the West Bank, Palestinians were celebrating today, even though there was a strong statement from Yasser Arafat condemning this attack. What is the situation there now, Martin?
Well, yeah, some Palestinians were celebrating, about 3,000 in the West Bank town of Nablus, a few dozen in East Jerusalem, also in other West Bank towns, Kalkilia, Bethlehem, Tulkarm. They were celebrating until Palestinian police stopped it. They were throwing sweets in the air, giving out cakes. Basically, the attitude is that the United States, because of its firm support for Israel in the conflict with the Palestinians, their feeling is, well, America had it coming. But I should point out very strongly that the Palestinian leadership declared itself immediately shocked. Yasser Arafat called the attacks today in the United States unbelievable. But there are strong feeling in the street among some Palestinians that America did have it coming.
All right, Martin Fletcher, what has been the reaction from the Israeli government?
Well, very little. They said they don't want to say anything until they know exactly what happened. Of course, shock at what happened, shock at the killings. But there's a great sense that that when it's found out who did this, that there may be a very strong Middle East connection, of course, and Israel seen as the strong ally of the United States. There's a sense that they don't want to exacerbate things at the moment by making it appear that this could have been a result of the American connection with Israel. So they're keeping quiet for the time being. Tremendous sympathy and shock, of course. But there's a sense that this story still has a long way to go. There could be more terror attacks. Israel itself on a very high state of alert today. The army put on what they call a high alert. They banned international flights from flying into Israel for at least 24 hours. People, big tall buildings in Israel, in Tel Aviv, have been evacuated. They've turned the lights out. A great sense that this may not be the end of the story by a long way.
Yeah, Martin, let's talk about that for just a moment. It has been a very volatile situation in Israel. A lot of people there have believed that war was inevitable between the PLO and the Israelis once again, if not to say other Arab states. But this is only going to escalate that kind of an attack or that kind of prospect, because in recent days, more moderate Arab states have also condemned the United States for not taking a more active role in resolving this rising level of violence between the Israelis and the PLO.
That's right. Even Egypt today, I believe, said that that America should examine its position, its policies in the region. The leader of Hamas, which is the Islamic militant group that sends most of the suicide bombers against Israeli targets in the last few months, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, he said America has to change its policies, that the people of the region are very angry with the United States. And there is a sense, and also, by the way, also among the Palestinian media in the West Bank and Gaza Strip in the last few weeks, there's been an upsurge of articles against the United States, some even calling for attacks against American targets. So America very much identified with Israel and the problems in the region. A great danger that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is spiraling, I don't want to say out of control, because it already seems out of control, but that things could get a lot worse and that neighboring countries could get pulled in. There's warnings from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon that they're going to start attacks across the Lebanese border against Israel. A very, very dangerous situation here, a powder keg. And what happened in the United States today, many here are seeing as a reflection of the troubles in this region. If indeed it turns out there is a Mideast connection, we don't yet know, of course, who did these terrible things in the United States, but a strong fear here that the Mideast connection is a very real one.
Thank you very much, NBC's Martin Fletcher, as we continue to look with a sense of disbelief at the magnitude of the destruction in Lower Manhattan, the physical destruction. To repeat, as we have throughout the day, we still don't know how many people remain trapped in the rubble, what the exact numbers are. But as you look at that scene, I'll leave it to you to determine in your own mind just how widespread the human loss will be in New York City alone. That's the situation in Lower Manhattan right now. Here's a scene that is unusual in New York. People going home. They were leaving the borough of Manhattan for Brooklyn and other boroughs by going across. I'm told that that's the Manhattan Bridge. It's in lower New York City, and it leads out of the city, and a lot of people went home. This city, the most vital places in the world, obviously, has been all but shut down today. Hospitals working overtime, traffic in Midtown and many of the high-rises have been evacuated. As we say, these flights that were originating in both in Boston and Newark and in Washington, D.C., no doubt did have some prominent people on board. We're beginning to get some sense of who some of the passengers may have been, but there's been no official release yet of the names of them. American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles, 92 people on board. Flight 77 from Dulles to LA, 62 on board. Flight 175, Boston to Los Angeles, 65 on board, and Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco, 45 on board. That was the flight that went down near Pittsburgh, the United and American flight that you see one on top of the other. Flight 111 and 175 went into the Twin Trade Towers, and Flight 77 is the one that we believe went into the Pentagon after a very low, swooping turn over Washington, D.C. on a day when the president was out of the Capitol and the Secretary of State was out of the Capitol, and people were anticipating some budget fights coming up in Congress. But America has changed today. This is a dark day in this country. It's in bold print in future history books about how America was attacked within its continental borders with devastating effect by terrorists in a coordinated assault using hijacked civilian airliners to do just that. I'm told that the president went into the underground bunkers called Stratcom on Offutt Air Force Base at 3:06 Eastern Time today. He will be meeting with the national security staff on a video teleconference. Offutt is south and just slightly east of Omaha. It's been a fixture there for a long, long time. And of course, it used to get a lot more attention during the Cold War because it was one of the places that B-52s would be launched for a counterattack, if necessary, against the Soviet Union. NBC's Campbell Brown outside the White House. Campbell?
Tom, we do have a little bit more information on what the president is doing right now. As you said earlier, he's at the Offutt Air Force Base. This is just outside of Omaha. This is, of course, the Strategic Command Center. And this information from the Pool reporter who is traveling with the president. They are allowing 5 members of the press corps to remain at least near the president in that area. And we have been told that he is participating, as you mentioned, in this National Security Council meeting by teleconference this afternoon. He's been in close contact with Vice President Cheney, and we have learned that the Vice President is in the White House. He's working out of the Operations Center in a secure area of the White House. We've also been told that the president has been in contact with his wife, that she is fine, but is also being held in a quote-unquote secure location, an undisclosed location. The president right now is traveling with a skeleton staff of close advisors. Press Secretary Ari Fleischer is with him, his advisor Karl Rove, Andy Card, who is Chief of Staff, and Dan Bartlett with him. Karen Hughes, counselor to the president, is expected to give a briefing here at the FBI headquarters to the White House press corps here in Washington. The president told reporters there that he is anxious to get back to Washington, but understands, given the circumstances and the security precautions that are necessary now, that he needs to be there where he is in a protected area. But again, this is a place where they have the most advanced communication systems, where he can be in close contact with his entire national security team. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Campbell Brown. In fact, that is the nerve center should this country go to war. Those are hardened bunkers deep in the ground. It was the original headquarters of Curtis LeMay, obviously, and Thomas Power, 2 of the legendary Air Force generals during the worst days of the Cold War, and it's out there in the Great Plains of the Midwest. Lee Hamilton, former senator from Indiana, joins us now. He is a widely recognized foreign policy and national security affairs expert. Mr. Hamilton, the political leadership in both parties, what should be the first moves once we get beyond the ability of get beyond this assignment that we have of rescuing all the people who are still trapped there and sorting out the physical damage?
I think a number of policy areas need to be reviewed and will be reviewed immediately. Everybody thinks first, of course, of intelligence. Our intelligence has been quite good, but massive failure today. There will be almost certainly heavy increases funding for intelligence. There'll be a lot of demands for more human intelligence. Secondly, I think there will be massive reviews of security, all kinds of state, local, federal installations and buildings. How can we improve the security? There'll be, third, a review of community responses. How effective are we in responding to these tragedies and how quickly? There will be foreign policy reviews, particularly with regard to the Middle East, in the likely event that that's the source of the terrorism. And there will certainly be a review of the priority of the threats that we confront as a nation. So I see this event as having very profound consequences in this country for years and years to come. And on policy, those changes will begin very soon.
I know that you have been one of those many people in Washington who have been concerned about the possibility of a terrorist attack, and we have been saying this throughout the day, but I think it does bear worth repeating. No contingency plan that I ever saw or even heard about, for that matter, prepared this country for an attack of this nature, so complex, so sophisticated, and carried out with such cold-blooded efficiency.
That's true, but also predictable. I think most every expert that I know on terrorism has said, as indeed some of the reports have said, that the American people are not as secure as they think they are in their homes and in their workplaces, that eventually the terrorists, because of their increased skills, increased sophistication, and because of the vulnerabilities of our communities and of this country, because of its openness, that eventually they would make their mark, and they have. Now, I don't think any of us predicted this particular kind of an attack, but the fact that you had a massive terrorist attack on American installations and cities should not come as a surprise.
Unfortunately, I think that that's a commentary that rings all too true. Former Congressman Lee Hamilton, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
It is a new day in America, a day of grieving and shock and anger, and a day of profound changes that are yet to come. In what form we cannot say for sure, but obviously this is not just an isolated incident in our lives. This is one that will be a marker in our history. And watching all of this from abroad is Alex Standish, who is with the Jane's Intelligence Digest, as one of the most highly regarded publications in the world in keeping track of just this kind of an incident. Mr. Standish, where were you and what did you think when you first heard that such a carefully coordinated and, I dare say, cold-blooded, efficient attack had been conducted against the United States?
Well, obviously, like all right-minded people, I was totally horrified, but I'm afraid I have to say not entirely surprised. As recently as Friday of last week, our publication specifically warned that anger in the Middle East directed towards the United States from the Islamic world was reaching crisis proportions. And we also specifically warned that there was an upsurge in terrorist activity in Lebanon, Afghanistan, and various other countries in the region, which were obviously being attended to by US intelligence. And so I think, as I say, we're horrified, but not surprised.
Why the United States has been trying to stay out of the Middle East. They've issued a couple of strong statements against rising Israeli violence, but it has not jumped in on the side of the Israelis, so to speak, in terms of this latest episode of exchanges between the PLO and Israel. Why do you think it came now?
Well, I think this has clearly been an operation which has been planned meticulously, possibly over months, even years. This is not something which has been put together overnight or even in the last couple of weeks. I think these individuals responsible for carrying out these appalling attacks are clearly people who have been in the United States for some time, or have been aided and abetted by those who have been in the country. They may well be what we would regard as sleeper agents. I think the timing is probably designed, as far as possible, at a time of renewed tension in the Middle East, to create really the conditions for derailing, possibly permanently, the peace process. But I think there is also an element in which recent pronouncements by President Bush, particularly his statement on the 24th of August, during which he called upon the Palestinians specifically to desist from terrorist activity, have certainly, I think, given the impression, even if that is not the case, that the United States was firmly in the pro-Israeli camp, as opposed to being an equal and honest broker within the peace process.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Standage, for being with us. We're going to go to Washington now. Our Washington Bureau Chief, NBC's Tim Russert. Tim?
Tom, it's extraordinary, the mood in Washington. As you know, the president is now out in Omaha, Strategic Command. People in Washington very much looking forward to hearing more from him. The fact that he has chosen to go there, a place which is the nerve center of all our military activity, is an indication that perhaps this threat has not ended. There was some thought that he may be coming back to Washington, and the fact that he has not underscores the concern that there still may be a continuing threat.
We've just been hearing from some of our people in the Middle East and other places saying it would be inappropriate to link this to the recent administration policies in the Middle East, Tim, because after all, as Mr. Standage just pointed out, this took a long time to plan this. This didn't happen in the last 6 weeks or so.
No, Tom, but there has been a steady stream of reports, very unsettling, from the Middle East. The head of Saudi Arabia intelligence resigned without much explanation. There's reports of a near insurrection in Georgia. Egypt has been experiencing a lot of street activity. Clearly, tensions and anxieties and incitements have become almost the norm, not only on the West Bank, but throughout the Middle East. So clearly, people here in Washington believe there is a tie and are targeting the notion that this is a direct response to the tensions in the Middle East, or at least that ongoing conflict. The other thing I can report, Tom, is that investigators are looking very, very closely. I reported earlier to you that, one, all the flights were bound to California with a heavy fuel load. They also now note that all 4 flights were Boeing 757s and 767s. I am told that these have exactly the same flight deck, that if you can fly a 757, you can fly a 767. And they note that rather than go for an Airbus or a 737, all 4 hijackings, exactly the same kind of aircraft, which leads them to believe that the terrorists were, in fact, could very well have been pilots themselves who have been in this country for some time or trained to fly those planes after hijacking them, because they underscore how difficult it is to control a plane of that size directly into a target like the World Trade Center or the Pentagon.
All right, Tim Russert, as we continue to look at pictures at the hospitals here in New York City as they offload the various injured people, many of them suffering from smoke inhalation. A lot of them were not in the World Trade Center itself. They could have been in the perimeter of it when it came down. There was an almost impenetrable wall of dust and smoke at that time. St. Vincent's and New York Hospital are both down in that area. New York has, as you might expect, both just across the line in New Jersey and in the other boroughs and in the city itself, a number of first-rate hospitals. CNBC's Ron Insana was down there, and he was caught in the midst of all of this as well. Now, when you look at that damage, Ron, you realize again how fortunate you were.
Absolutely, Tom. With the debris raining down, it was certainly a harrowing moment for many people in the lower reaches of Manhattan. And it, you know, as Tim Russert was suggesting, this attack clearly was designed to have maximum impact, not just in terms of the toll on human life or the political impact, but the economic impact as well. The World Trade Center is home to several Wall Street brokerage houses, to a few exchanges where gold and silver and things like that are traded. It is, in some ways, the financial nerve center of New York City. And we have to remember that at least 1/3 of all financial transactions in this country are routed through New York City. So it is very difficult at this time to assess what the economic damage is going to be to the country and to the systems that keep it running. Now, Federal Reserve officials and Securities and Exchange Commission officials say that they are in constant contact now to discuss their response to this. And one would assume also that the Federal Reserve, if required, would add what they call liquidity or money to the financial system in order to maintain something of an orderly economic environment. This comes at a time, of course, when the U.S. economy has slowed, where stock prices have come down in historic fashion, Tom, over the last 15 months. This is the type of event that will have rather severe economic consequences on top of everything we already know.
All right, thanks very much, CNBC's Ron Insana. I'm just reading one of the wire reports from the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. One of the passengers on board, we had heard this earlier, managed to get off a cell phone call to an emergency dispatcher saying that we're being hijacked. The plane went down about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. There's been some speculation that it might have been directed at another target of some kind as well, the Capitol or Camp David. We don't know, but it went down at that point. The man was in the bathroom. He had locked himself in the bathroom apparently at that time to say that they were being hijacked. There was an explosion, there was some smoke, and the plane went into a grassy field. All on board that United flight were killed, as you can see, just outside of Pittsburgh in Somerset County. It was that bizarre morning in which there were planes in the air, and some of the airlines didn't know what had happened to them. United, for a time, didn't know what had happened to that flight. In fact, we did know pretty quickly that the American airline flight 11 that went into the Twin Trade Towers first had started in Boston and then gone in there. And as we've been saying throughout the day, these were transcontinental flights and they had a heavy load of fuel, and they might have been picked for just that reason. And Tim Russert was pointing out that if you can fly a 757 or a 767, the flight decks are so similar. So these were probably trained pilots, because it's hard to imagine an American commercial airline pilot, even with a gun to his or her head, that would dive a plane into the Pentagon or into the Trade Center. And of course, which makes this kind of terrorism all the more difficult to deal with, is there are so many people who are willing to die for their cause, as they were in this case. The hijackers went down with the plane, with the planes here in New York and also in Pennsylvania, and again in Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon, where it could have been so much worse. It also tells you about the liberties that we have in this country, that 4 airlines were hijacked today. They flew over the nation's capital. One report indicating that it banked right over the top of the White House before heading for the Pentagon. It was a flight that had taken off from Dulles Air Force Base. And then the flights here in New York, wrapping around the twin towers of the World Trade Center and crashing into them. So you may think that you're inconvenienced by airport security, or that you have been in the past. Think about what it's going to be like in the future and how reassuring it will be to you if it gets tightened up considerably, because it will have to be. Those are just one of the many changes that will occur. James Baker is former Secretary of State, former Secretary of the Treasury. He joins us now. He's on the telephone for us. Mr. Baker, this is a stunning and dark day for America.
It is indeed a stunning and dark day. It is a very tragic and sorrowful day, Tom, and I can't imagine acts that are more dastardly or cowardly than what has been done.
There has been a fair amount of discussion today about the United States' role in the Middle East, about how we are inseparable in the minds of the Palestinians and other Arab states with the Israelis. You spend a lot of time in that part of the world. Has it gotten worse, do you think, in the last 2 months?
Oh, I think that the circumstances on the ground in the Middle East have gotten significantly worse in the last 2 months. But then that's really pretty much, Tom, an axiom of Middle East policy, that when there's no progress at the diplomatic table, if there's no political progress, then there's going to be increased violence on the ground. But I must say to you, as bad as it is, I'm not at all sure that we should jump too fast to relate this to the absence of progress in the Middle East peace process over the course of the past 2 or 3 months, because we've had these types of we've had attempts in the past which have been rolled up that had nothing at all to do with the Middle East peace process.
And we continue to be the favorite target of especially Islamic extremists around the world, and whether or not it's related to the Middle East peace process.
That's correct. That's the point I'm making.
Where do we go from here? If you were sitting at the national security table tonight with the President of the United States, what would you be recommending? And I don't want to put you on the spot to try to make it more difficult than it already is for your friend, the President of the United States, but conceptually speaking.
There are not a lot of easy answers. The President
that they specifically thought that there was another building that was in trouble. They just said they were nervous, in their words, about a couple of buildings, and then specifically cited Building 7, which is the building that we just referred to. Katie.
All right, Pat Dawson. Pat, thank you very much. Meanwhile, Dan Abrams is on the telephone, apparently at the scene. Dan, what can you tell us?
Well, hi there, Katie. I'm standing about 5 or 6 blocks away from where that building just collapsed. The one piece of good news is...
Okay, obviously we have lost contact with Dan Abrams, who is nearby the building, as he said, that just collapsed. We'll try to maintain contact with him in just a few minutes. Meanwhile, Osama bin Laden is a name that we have been hearing all day long as an individual who may, and we emphasize may, be responsible for these terrorist acts. It is a name we have heard before as well. Hoda Kotb has this report.
The early focus is on guerrilla leader Osama bin Laden because of the level of logistics necessary to carry out today's series of attacks. Bin Laden is a millionaire Saudi businessman believed to be living in exile in Afghanistan. U.S. officials link bin Laden to numerous terrorist attacks, including last year's bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen. He was blamed for the 1998 bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, in which 224 people died. And one of his top lieutenants was convicted this year of plotting to bomb the Los Angeles International Airport at the turn of the millennium. An Arab journalist with access to bin Laden told Reuters that the guerrilla leader had warned just 3 weeks ago of a, quote, unprecedented attack on U.S. interests. Since 1998, he has declared all U.S. citizens legitimate targets of attack. The tall, thin bin Laden's goal, in his own words, is to unite all Muslims and establish a government which follows Islamic law. His network supports terrorists in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Chechnya, Somalia, Yemen, and Kosovo. We should note, though, that just hours after the attacks, Afghanistan's hardline Taliban rulers condemned them, rejecting suggestions that bin Laden is behind them.
Meanwhile, NBC's Andrea Mitchell is at the State Department this afternoon. Andrea, what are State Department officials saying about the possibility that this is the man responsible for these attacks?
Usually they are very cautious about drawing these conclusions. Since the State Department was evacuated, Katie, I'm here in our newsroom and talking to national security officials, intelligence officials, and others in the government. They now believe that bin Laden was responsible. They have seen some evidence since the attack this morning pinning this on those involved with bin Laden's organization. A global organization that George Tenet has been warning Congress is the one organization capable of multiple attacks with no warning. This is his MO. This is the way he, according to the indictment and the arrest warrant, was able to attack both the embassy in Tanzania and in Nairobi, Kenya, almost simultaneously. It is a requirement of a great deal of coordination, of money, of expertise, a global terror network, if you will, which has been almost unique to bin Laden. So while he was immediately under suspicion, we are now told from top U.S. officials that they have seen evidence, which we can presume is some sort of electronic eavesdropping evidence, that in fact bin Laden was in some way responsible for this. That is certainly their operational theory. And regarding Hoda's report, the Taliban leaders of Afghanistan would be well advised to deny any complicity because they've been harboring him within weeks. Only weeks ago, U.S. officials warned the Taliban that if anything happened to the U.S., they would hold the Taliban, the leaders of Afghanistan, personally responsible. So if there is going to be a retaliation, based on the evidence that they are now indicating to us here at NBC News, you can bet that that retaliation will most likely be against Afghanistan. Katie?
Andrea, of course, many people are asking the question, why now, why today? And I thought it was interesting when I read this afternoon that in June, a U.S. judge had set tomorrow as the sentencing date for a bin Laden associate for his role in the '98 bombing of that U.S. embassy in Tanzania that killed 213 people. The sentencing had been set for the federal courthouse near the World Trade Center, but the sentencing had been postponed some time ago without being rescheduled. Has anybody commented on the fact that the sentencing was scheduled for tomorrow?
Well, it is the sentencing. There are other facts. There is a case in Los Angeles right now involving a bin Laden associate who had been involved in allegedly masterminding one of the Millennium bombing plots that was foiled, and there have been intelligence successes. There was also a threat during that millennial period that bin Laden was involved in trying to organize attacks on 3 tourist locations in Jordan that are frequented by Americans, and an attack that was planned, according to the FBI, on a U.S. destroyer in the area of Yemen, all foiled around the time of the millennium. But as you well know, Katie, only 6 months later, terrorists did ram the USS Cole in October of last year, killing 17 U.S. sailors. And afterwards, recently in June, bin Laden, on a home video, a training video, a remarkable piece of tape, took credit for killing sailors and issued this tape, which was a recruitment tape for more people to target America. One of the things that we should point out here, as you've just suggested, is that there is a long history between the U.S. and bin Laden. Although he was never indicted for his involvement or alleged involvement in the World Trade Center bombing in 1993, he is known to have harbored Ramzi Youssef, who was convicted for masterminding that, both before and after the bombing attack, in bin Laden organization safe houses. So this is a loose confederation of terrorist networks, but bin Laden is deeply involved, according to U.S. officials. As Hoda pointed out, he has a lot of money. He was Saudi-born, of both Yemeni and Palestinian parents, but disowned by his Saudi family and disowned and kicked out, really, by the Saudi government. But the initial anger that he felt against the U.S. after being trained in Afghanistan to fight the Russians in that war was because of the U.S. involvement in the Persian Gulf.
Andrea, as you well know, in the early hours following the attack this morning, an organization, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, initially claimed responsibility. It was later denied. Yasser Arafat has condemned the attack, and yet there are celebrations on the streets in Palestine. People have been distributing candy to people on the streets and cheering that God is great, celebrating, if you will, these 2 attacks. What is the State Department's position on that happening in Palestine?
They are well aware of the reaction of the West Bank and Gaza because of the strong feeling against the United States. But we've also been talking to ambassadors from Jordan, from Egypt, other officials who are pointing out that this is not a universal reaction, that the moderate Arab leaders are condemning this, as have other American allies around the world. So, as you know, a result of the terror and of the violence in the Middle East and in the West Bank and Gaza for these many months, you're going to see this kind of emotional response, but it is not really indicative of the leaders of the Arab world.
Andrea, let me also ask you about Secretary of State Colin Powell. I know he is on his way back from Lima, Peru. He was scheduled to be in Bogota, Colombia, but he decided, obviously, to return to the United States. Can you tell us his plans and when he is expected to reach Washington, if in fact that is where he's headed?
We believe he was headed to Florida, and then we think from Florida on to Washington. One of the things that happened in Lima, Peru, before he left was a strong statement by Colin Powell saying that these terrorists can attack our buildings, they can kill, they can maim, they can destroy, but they cannot destroy the American spirit. They cannot destroy the United States of America. A very stern and angry Colin Powell at the Organization of American States in Lima, Peru today.
All right, Andrea Mitchell, State Department correspondent in our Washington bureau this afternoon. Andrea, thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie.
And Katie, we have word now, according to the AP, that approximately 100 people are confirmed dead in the attack on the Pentagon early this morning, We're not clear as to whether that number includes the number of people who are on the jetliner that was crashed into that building. But again, the AP is now reporting that approximately 100 people were killed in the Pentagon prong of this four-prong attack.
We should mention 64 people were aboard that plane that crashed into the Pentagon. 27 people have been taken to a hospital in Arlington, Virginia. 8 others who had been injured to a Washington hospital as well.
Do we have Ken Allard on the phone now?
In the studio.
Oh, there we go. Ken is an international terrorism expert. Ken, good morning to you. Good afternoon to you, excuse me.
How are you, Matt?
I'm fine, thank you. When you hear the U.S. officials saying they are already looking in the direction of Osama bin Laden, do you think they're looking in the right place?
I think so. Matt, I mean, the sophistication of this attack, the fact that it was elaborately planned, flawlessly executed, and as audaciously conceived as it was, all that evidence points in one direction. So until something else happens, you clearly look for your leading suspect. That's Osama bin Laden.
And for Americans who had, I guess, enjoyed some sense of security, thinking that perhaps Osama bin Laden and his organizers and compatriots were operating in other places, it appears that this had to have been organized, at least with great help, inside our own borders.
Matt, that's probably one of the most worrying aspects of this, because it has been an article of faith among U.S. counterintelligence people that operating inside the United States was something that was difficult, maybe even impossible. Among the other things that came down today, along with those buildings, were those preconceptions. We now know that he has been able to operate successfully inside this country, and that indeed he has a support network here. That's going to be a very tough thing to go in and root out.
And staying on that subject, when we talk about a massive intelligence breach here, the fact that no intelligence picked up a warning that this attack may have been coming, it's one thing if our intelligence overseas missed this, it's another thing if our intelligence right here in the United States missed it.
Well, the thing that is, I think, going to really tell the tale here is precisely the effort to find out what did our intelligence agencies know and when did they know it? What did they pass along? We've been saying all day that it is very, very reminiscent, of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And after the attack on Pearl Harbor, guess what we did? We went back and found out that, yes, the evidence was there. We should have known. And again, I think what we're going to see, even in this instance, this Pearl Harbor of the 21st century, is very much the same kind of thing.
And Ken, let's explain the difference here. People are already saying that we have perhaps too much technical intelligence and not enough human intelligence. Describe the difference and how each would be used.
Well, basically, it's the difference between getting intelligence by machines, mostly satellites, eavesdropping, and that kind of thing, from the very nitty-gritty business that obtains when you're doing human intelligence, i.e. spies, and counterintelligence. And all that basically means is that you are going out, you're penetrating those organizations so that when they are planning an attack, you've got somebody on the inside. It is a very tough, very dirty business, but it's the kind of thing that you have to do. And for the last 20 years in our intelligence establishment, we've not done nearly enough to train and acquire the kinds of people that can give us that kind of intelligence. And again, now we find out just how desperately that kind of information is needed.
When the president talks about hunting down those responsible and punishing those people or anyone who harbored those people, short of an admission of guilt or a claim of responsibility from Osama bin Laden or some other group, how are they going to put the pieces together to be sure that they're striking back in the right direction?
Well, Matt, it's said that revenge is a dish best eaten cold. And I think that while we are all tempted to want to lash out immediately, this is going to be the kind of thing that we have to get right. And part of the reason for that is the fact that this is going to be, again, an effort that's going to entail the intelligence agencies, our diplomatic efforts, as well as our military. And it's terribly important that we get these targets right. It's terribly important that we not just do the kind of pinprick attacks that we've had in the past. This is all or nothing.
Ken, talk about the coordination that was required to pull this off with 2 planes striking the World Trade Center within 20 minutes of one another, and then 20 minutes later, another at the Pentagon, and a short time after that, the 4th plane crashing in Pittsburgh.
Matt, the coordination here I cannot say enough about, simply because of the fact that in the military we talk about time over target, time on target. And what you had here, it was necessary for the terrorists to do that, because once we copped to the idea that there were systematic attacks underway, we could take countermeasures. They did all this within the space of about half an hour, 45 minutes. And what they had to do was to be in communication. They had to have a good plan. They had to be well positioned, and they had to have excellent communications with each other to know that the operation was all underway. The thing that's amazing, too, is the fact that they had to have some understanding of the weather. The weather both here in Washington as well as in New York was absolutely perfect. It was the crystal clear kind of weather that you would want to have if you're planning an operation like this.
I'm sorry, Ken, the physical target, obviously, they brought down 2 towers of the World Trade Center, a section of the Pentagon, and it seems luckily no building was hit outside Pittsburgh. But talk for a second, if you will, about the emotional target that they managed to strike this day.
Matt, everything that they did brought the war home to the United States. They struck deliberately at our financial center. They struck deliberately at our transportation network. They struck deliberately at the military apparatus of the United States. And much more critically, what they took on was the power, the prestige, and the might of the United States. So, among other things, this is going to require a response that is totally out of proportion to anything that we've seen in the counterterrorist war to this point.
Ken Allard. Ken, thanks very much.
Pleasure, Matt.
Katie?
Matt, as you well know, scores of New York hospitals and hospitals in the New York area have been mobilized to deal with the thousands of people who were injured and critically injured, some even killed in the blast. Bob Bazell spent most of the day at St. Vincent's Hospital here in Manhattan. Bob, what can you tell us? Do you have any clear numbers at this point in time, or is that still impossible to say?
It's very difficult to say, Katie, but what's kind of frightening right now is that the numbers are fairly low, and low is a relative term in this context. But right now we know of about 1,000 casualties in all the New York area hospitals that have been taking them in. The one where I was, St. Vincent's Hospital, had us about 250. As you can see from that picture, some of them are horribly burned and mangled in other ways. In addition to the burn injuries, the hospitals have been receiving concussion injuries from people who were hit by falling stone and broken glass. But the numbers are low because probably most of the victims are still buried in the rubble, and and the rescuers can't get to it because of the intense flames that we've been seeing all day. In addition to that, about 1 in 5 of the people who were brought in seriously injured or dead were either firefighters, policemen, or EMS workers. So an enormous number of the people who were injured today were rescue workers because of this timing between the crash into an explosion in the first World Trade Center tower and the second one. A lot of people were going in to put out that emergency, and then the second building exploded, and then there were the collapse. So we were seeing a lot of heroic firefighters and police and emergency service workers who were injured as well. In addition to this injury story, Katie, today has been a day, of course, like none other in New York. All day long, people were embracing each other on the street, strangers crying, people hysterically looking for their children. New York City schools kept the children all day long, but everybody wanted to know where their children were. The subways stopped running. People had relatives inside those buildings. Of course, enormous numbers of people worked in the World Trade Center. There was one nurse at St. Vincent's Hospital where I was who was on an email with her husband who was in the standing tower. He was assuring her he was okay. The email went blank. She looked out the window and the building collapsed. We're going to hear hundreds, probably thousands of stories like that in the next few days as we get more and more information out of this. But for a while today, Katie, as you also know, the New York City subway system was closed down. There was no way to get anywhere. People were just wandering around aimlessly and looking at the smoking hulks of what used to be one of the major landmarks of the city. Katie?
In fact, Bob, some of that video of people sort of wandering around in a daze, sort of aimlessly, completely covered with soot and ash, almost looking ghost-like. Did you see many of those people kind of wandering or being helped to St. Vincent's?
I did indeed, Katie, because St. Vincent's is the closest trauma center to the World Trade Center, and it's where the biggest number of trauma victims went. And a lot of family members came there looking for their loved ones. Also, downtown Manhattan, for people, or southern Manhattan, for people who are familiar with the geography, was just closed off. Nobody could go in there, but people could walk out, and it was like an enormous army of dazed people covered with ash who kept walking up the major thoroughfares, going north, trying to find their way home or somewhere away from the smoke, the dust, and the death that they had seen everywhere. I saw ambulance workers today, Katie, crying. These are people who have seen the most horrible things on earth that you could imagine, and yet they hadn't imagined that they would ever see anything like this today. Policemen were crying, firemen were crying. It was, I don't think anybody had ever imagined that New York City or any city in the United States would ever face a trauma, a crisis like the one we're seeing today.
I know that Cardinal Egan was on hand from the New York Archdiocese, offering his prayers, even delivering last rites to some of the victims who were brought to St. Vincent's.
Yes, he was there, and he was saying religious He had religious sentiments for people of all faiths who were brought in there. St. Vincent's happens to be a Catholic hospital, but it's not just for Catholics, of course. And the sense of death, destruction is enormous, but the most eerie thing about standing in the emergency room is that things went much slower than anticipated. There still are enormous numbers of people under that rubble, and it's going to be a long time. The people at the hospitals expect to be taking care of survivors for many days to come.
How about staffing, Bob? Are they concerned about that, or are they pretty hopeful that they'll have enough medical professionals on hand to deal with the people who continue to stream in there?
Well, the New York City Emergency Services systems had a plan for this that worked as far as we can tell, very well. They set up triage centers in 2 locations at least, maybe more, in the downtown region, and they sent people off to various hospitals so that no one hospital was swamped. And in fact, a large number of people were taken on the Staten Island ferry across the Hudson River to hospitals both on Staten Island, and even a much larger number to hospitals in New Jersey. And so as a result, the hospitals have managed to be able to deal with the load that they've had, and they're starting to get ready for the long haul. Everybody who was on the staff of every hospital showed up volunteering. At one point in St. Vincent's Hospital, which is in Greenwich Village, they put out a call for blood donors, and so many showed up, hundreds and hundreds of people within minutes showed up, that they had to take them in buses to other hospitals where there was still a great need for blood. But nobody thinks this story, in terms of caring for the survivors, is anywhere near its end.
All right, Bob Bazell. Bob, thank you so much for that report and for talking with us this afternoon. We appreciate it. Incidentally, 2 makeshift morgues have been set up here in Manhattan, one in the borough of Manhattan Community College, the second at Greenwich Street and the corner of Northmore, and a 3rd makeshift morgue may be set up a little bit later on. Matt?
And as Bob may have mentioned, New Yorkers have been lining up at some hospitals looking to donate blood for survivors who may be in need. Ashley Banfield has been down in the area near the World Trade Center reporting all day. She joins us now. Ashley?
Hi, Matt. I'm having a tough time hearing you, but there are a number of emergency vehicles that are now coming out of the vicinity of number 7 World Trade Center that has just gone down. And I just wanted to let you know very quickly, before that, number 6 World Trade Center went down, and housed in those 2 buildings, offices of OSHA, U.S. Customs, ATF, and a number of other retail spaces as well. Not only that, but financial offices too. Those buildings had all been cleared out after the first plane hit the World Trade Center this morning. So there was some speculation that there's not a soul in those buildings at the time. Certainly, number 7 that just went down as we were live on the air earlier on with MSNBC was cleared out. Most people, they said earlier that they were just waiting for that building to go down. So they were expecting this to happen. Not only that, it is still an awesome sight when this happens. I just wanted to introduce you very quickly to Mel and his son Max, who have basically evacuated their own house. You live just down this way, just past this red building, is that right?
Yeah, Duane Street, just by Chambers Street.
You just picked up your animals and one overnight bag and gotten out of there. Were you told by anybody that you needed to get out of there quickly?
No, actually, we had a hard time getting back there because the whole area's been cut off. But we'd already left, but we didn't have any of our stuff. So now we're trying to get back because the water, the electricity's all been cut off, and we basically have to move out of the area.
Where are you going to spend the night?
Friend's house. We have, our children, our other children in Brooklyn. We can't even figure out how to get there. So,
Max, you were in school, you were in high school, not far away. You could see the actual plane crash and the fireball that ensued after that.
Well, I was in class and my friend said, "Oh my God, someone bombed the World Trade Center," and we all said that's not funny. And we looked out the window and there was an explosion. Then we turned on the news and we saw on the TV the smoke and the coverage. We saw another plane going. I said, "Well, is this a replay of some sort?" And we looked out the window and we saw the explosion carry through the other side of the building.
And they just kept you in the school at that point?
They kept us in the school, and I think it was a smart idea because if they kept us in the school, like that way kids wouldn't run down there and see what was happening. And then later they evacuated the school.
All right, thanks very much and good luck to you. I hope you are all safe. Matt, I just wanted to tell you really quickly what happened earlier. We have been moved about 5 different times. My producer and I, early this morning, right after the first World Trade Center came down, were caught in the debris of the collapsing second World Trade Center. In fact, our clothes are still covered with all of this gray ash, and that's what you see when you see a lot of the people who are coming out of that epicenter. They're covered from head to toe in gray. Some of the emergency vehicles that have been coming through here as well, windows blown out. We saw an ambulance that was completely burned out on one side. The windows were blown out. The ambulance driver just told us as he was rolling by, this was a brand new ambulance this morning. Not only that, but we can tell you that we've been moved 5 times because there is the concern that more buildings will collapse. We are not being told now that any more buildings are in peril of collapsing, but we have heard other buildings potentially nearby are unstable. They are keeping us at this particular perimeter because there's not too much concern that the wind is going to blow northward. The wind has been blowing eastward off of the island of Manhattan and into the other boroughs east in Brooklyn. But at this point, we seem to be okay at this vantage point, and we are about, I'd say about 7 blocks from where 7 World Trade Center stood just within the half hour.
All right, Ashley Banfield reporting from downtown. Ashley, thanks very much. Just a reminder that airports across the country are closed. There's a ground hold in effect until about noon, at least noon tomorrow. For a while, the borders between the U.S. and Canada and the U.S. and Mexico were closed. We're not sure whether those have been reopened. There was a high state of alert issued for nuclear power plants across the country. Obviously, some fear that if planes had been hijacked, that one might target a nuclear facility. Again, so much of life in America as we know it has been disrupted, and that, of course, is one of the targets of terrorism.
That's right. We want to remind people also, once again, Matt, that President Bush will address the nation at some point tonight. When we find out specifically when, we will let you know. Meanwhile, there is a sports facility, a massive sports facility called Chelsea Piers here in Manhattan, which is about 20 blocks away from the World Trade Center, from the Twin Towers, which we've been watching first burn and then totally collapse all day today. Apparently, a triage unit has been set up at that facility. Soledad O'Brien is on the phone now. Soledad, what can you tell us is happening there?
Well, Katie, you're absolutely right. The Chelsea Piers, which is, as you described it, a massive, sprawling athletic complex, has been set up as a triage facility, and it runs along, of course, the West Side Highway. Looking up the West Side Highway, looking down the West Side Highway, ambulances lined up one after the other. They are all on active standby because the doctors inside this triage unit, who as of yet are not treating any patients, have been told the fire is just burning too hot. They can't actually get in to rescue people and then bring them here. They are, however, on active standby. We have seen easily 100 doctors in and out. They've come from area hospitals, and by area hospitals, I mean not only here in New York City, but also Connecticut, New Jersey. Doctors have volunteered their time, nurses as well, EMTs. In addition, there's also a line for other volunteers who've come by, and a line where they are taking blood donations because, of course, as many have mentioned before me, they're looking and they need desperately blood to be donated. So they are on active standby inside the Chelsea Piers on a basketball court, in addition to some of the studios that are working studios here at Chelsea Piers. They've set up hundreds of tables. These are going to be makeshift operating tables, and as soon as those ambulances come by, they're going to bring folks in who are survivors, hopefully, and be able to work on them. Although there are many doctors that we have talked to today who said that they also could expect, because of the size and the sprawl of this facility, it could as well be turned into a morgue. They are saying at this time no one can get in there, it's too hot, and they are just on standby for whatever horrific, and they tell me they are expecting a horrific scene as soon as they can get in there to rescue some of the folks inside.
All right, Soledad O'Brien. Soledad, thank you very much.
CNBC's Ron Insana has been very close to this story throughout the day. He was actually close to the World Trade Center when one of the towers collapsed. And Ron, I know that was a close call for you personally, but I'm curious if you could just inform us a little more about the types of offices that are located at the World Trade Center and their importance to the financial markets in this country and around the world.
Well, Matt, the World Trade Center is one of the nerve centers in Lower Manhattan where there are not just financial firms, Morgan Stanley being the biggest financial client or tenant in that building, but there are exchanges that trade gold and silver. We have seen other firms like Cantor Fitzgerald, which is not well known among the general public, but is a very large NASDAQ-style trading firm. So this is one of the financial nerve centers in Lower Manhattan where there is a great deal of activity every day. There are trading rooms. There is, as we said, an exchange. Commodities are traded there. It's an environment where now a couple things are going to be called into question. One, the viability of some of the client firms to make good on whatever outstanding transactions they had prior to today. To the extent that financial activity is impaired, permanently impaired at the World Trade Center, that may have a feedback effect elsewhere. We should point out that the financial market response around the world today was dramatic. We saw stocks drop somewhere between 6 and 8% in Europe today. Gold prices spiked up rather dramatically in overseas markets, and then we also had oil go up more than $3 a barrel on the world oil markets as well. So the effects, not just to the financial markets themselves, but to the economy, are being questioned and analyzed all around the world this evening, Matt.
And of course, we've heard that the markets here in this country were closed today. We've been told they'll be closed again tomorrow. I mean, how long can we expect them to be shut down until they can get up and running again?
Well, there are so many sensitive issues to be dealt with, not the least of which will be security for the participants in those marketplaces downtown, the New York Stock Exchange being the principal exchange in Lower Manhattan. It is likely, one would assume, that because of the worry that disrupting the financial markets could be worse than letting them open up and respond to the situation, that tomorrow may be the only day on which the various exchanges are closed. That remains to be seen, and there will be a decision tomorrow as to whether or not the New York Stock Exchange will remain closed beyond Wednesday. Latin American markets, for instance, will decide tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Eastern Time whether or not to open as scheduled. There will be regular trading in Tokyo tonight. So financial regulators, policymakers will be deciding over the next several hours whether to allow the markets to respond to this catastrophe and let them take their course. The biggest question right now is how this event is going to affect consumer psychology in this country, and will this terrorist attack create a level of uncertainty and possibly even panic among consumers that they really curtail their spending, which could throw the U.S. economy into an official recession. That's the worry among economists this evening.
All right. CNBC's Ron Insana. Ron, thank you very much. Katie?
Skip Brandon is the former FBI counterterrorism chief. He joins us from Washington. Mr. Brandon, thank you for joining us. What will the FBI's role be in determining who was responsible for these attacks and also in protecting the United States from future attacks as well?
They'll be the lead law enforcement agency in the effort, and they'll coordinate all of the efforts of not only law enforcement but of the intelligence community in this. This will be probably the largest effort the FBI has ever undertaken.
You know, senior U.S. intelligence officials, or one senior U.S. intelligence official, says now that the U.S. is 90% certain that bin Laden was responsible for today's attack. Would you concur with that conclusion?
I think that's a very good possibility. You have to look at who has the organization and who has the capability to do something like this. And of course, bin Laden's Al-Qaeda organization has to be right at the top of the list. I agree.
Well, tell us, I mean, it seems that people are drawing that conclusion because this seems to be his organization's MO in the past. Can you describe other attacks that he is believed to be responsible for and why this seems to follow suit?
One of his people actually did the World Trade Center the first time it was bombed, a group that was affiliated with him. And the embassy bombings that have happened most recently are the ones that come to mind immediately. One thing that's interesting is that one of the people that did train with him, who was involved in the World Trade Center, had been almost caught in the Philippines during an explosion. The investigators, after this explosion, found evidence in his apartment which indicated large-scale attacks and the use of American airplanes blowing them out of the air, a variation on what happened today.
All right. Skip Brandon, former FBI counterterrorism chief. Again, Mr. Brandon, thanks so much.
Katie, all day long we've been hearing horrifying stories from people who were eyewitnesses to at least one portion of this attack. Harry Crosby is a managing director at Merrill Lynch, a company that has its offices in Lower Manhattan. Harry, good morning. Good afternoon, excuse me. It's been a long day.
Hi, Matt. How are you?
Tell me, I'm fine, thank you. Tell me, I know you got fairly close to the World Trade Center towers at the point before they were collapsing, and you explained something and described something to me on the phone before that stopped my heart, and that was the images you saw of people scrambling to escape the flames on one of those towers, and then some of those people actually jumping off those towers.
Yes, I think the thing that was most harrowing, we tend to ignore common sense. I was about 3 blocks away. The first building had already been hit. The second building had just been hit. And the impact of the second building, of the plane coming from the second building, came from the south. So to me, from where I stood, it looked like a massive explosion. I continued to see people actually go in both directions, oddly enough. I think people were evacuating all buildings. I was actually, at that time, trying to get to work. and basically stood and watched, a bit like a deer in the headlights, the people evacuating. The fire was tremendous in the first building, the northmost tower, and people could not escape, I think, the heat. They continued to go up, it appears, and there were an enormous number of people that jumped from the building.
So you're talking about people jumping from above probably the 80th or 90th floor, and we've had reports that some people were actually leaving windows in the building holding hands.
They were jumping in pairs. They were jumping. It was raining people. It was amazing to see, and while you think you should turn away and escape, I think everybody was just frozen and watching. There was a lot of crying. I think that a lot of people were extremely disturbed, but very few people left the scene. The other thing that was quite disturbing, I think no one, including myself, questioned the integrity and the strength of both the buildings that collapsed. Most of the police were there. They responded quickly and tried to make way for EMS and paramedics and others to get close to the building. And I think a lot of people were in fact trapped when the first building collapsed. I had then moved north towards the Travelers Building, 388 Greenwich, and at that point it was spooky, and just escaped the first collapse.
All right, Harry Crosby. Harry, thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt.
I know that we're going to be hearing many harrowing stories along those lines. I know Harry said to us there were about 100 or 150 people who jumped to their deaths from the high floors of the World Trade Center. Again, it's been quite a day. We started by watching just before 9 o'clock a gaping hole that we thought was some kind of plane accident that had crashed into the World Trade Center, and we watched and saw live a second plane crash into the second Twin Tower. Later we heard about the Pentagon, and then of course that fourth terrible crash outside Pittsburgh. Some stations will be staying with us, some will be returning to local news. We will have blanket coverage on this NBC station either way. For those of you who are staying with us, now here's Brian Williams.
Today we've had a national tragedy.
I've never seen anything like it. It literally blew itself into World Trade Center.
Just a short time ago, saw the tail end of a large airliner plunge into the Pentagon.
I was in the building because I was driving a friend. So I'm worried for her safety.
The World Trade Center is no more.
This is a live picture at the column of smoke and ash still billowing up from the lower Manhattan area of New York over the skyline, which will now be forever changed as terrorists today crashed two hijacked jetliners into the World Trade Center and brought down the twin 110-story towers. Another hijacked commercial jetliner crashed into the Pentagon in Washington. Good evening to you. I'm Brian Williams. It is 6 p.m. on the East Coast, 3 p.m. on the West Coast on what has been one of the most horrifying days in American history. Terrorists carrying out well-planned, well-coordinated attacks that have left perhaps thousands dead, thousands more injured. President Bush is vowing to hunt down those responsible. He is due to address the nation tonight at a time yet to be announced. This all got underway at 8:50 a.m. Eastern Time as American Airlines Flight 11, hijacked after leaving Boston Logan Airport for Los Angeles LAX with 92 people on board, crashes into the South Tower of the World Trade Center, leaving a gaping hole. There are gaping holes in the building and at the top floors in flames. Then at 9:08 a.m. Eastern Time, United Airlines Flight 175, en route from Washington to Los Angeles with 65 on board, crashes into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The entire terrifying scene captured on videotape as it happened. Then, 9:30 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77, carrying 64 people from Washington to Los Angeles, crashes at the Pentagon outside Washington, the heart of the Defense Department. One of the building's 5 sides collapses. Then, between 9:50 and 10:30